They had been taught to believe they were part of the most advanced, disciplined, and unstoppable military machine in the world. From the moment they entered the ranks of the Wehrmacht, German soldiers were told that the Third Reich stood at the pinnacle of human achievement, militarily, technologically, and industrially. Their factories, they believed, were the envy of the world, precision engineered, highly specialized, and dedicated entirely to the war effort. They marched into battle with the confidence of men whose homeland, they were sure, could outproduce and outlast any enemy. But when the tide of war turned, and many of them found themselves prisoners in distant American camps, something shattered that illusion. These captured soldiers, many of them veterans of the brutal campaigns across Europe and North Africa, some former factory workers or engineers, were stunned by what they saw. On the surface, American towns seemed ordinary, almost too ordinary. Streets lined with grocery stores, diners, schools, and car dealerships. Suburbs filled with comfortable homes and quiet neighborhoods. But beneath that peaceful exterior lay an industrial power unlike anything they had imagined. They learned, often through first-hand observation or conversations with guards and locals, that every one of those peaceful factories, every small-town assembly line, every humming plant making cars, radios, or washing machines could be, and often was, transformed into a producer of tanks, planes, bombs, and rifles almost overnight. For men who came from a country where factories were highly specialized and conversion took months, sometimes years, the idea that America could switch from building refrigerators to fighter planes in a matter of weeks was almost unthinkable. Yet this was the reality of the United States during World War II. This was the arsenal of democracy, a phrase President Franklin D. Roosevelt had used to describe the nation's destiny. And for the German prisoners who had once believed their country stood unrivaled in industrial might, it was a deeply humbling and even frightening revelation. To understand why this was so shocking, we have to look at the way Germany approached war production and how fundamentally different it was from the American model. German industry before and during the war was built around specialization and precision. Factories were designed with specific purposes in mind. One plant would produce aircraft engines, another would focus solely on small arms, another on tanks. This specialization had its strengths. German engineering was often among the finest in the world, but it also created rigidity. Converting a civilian plant into a military one required retooling, retraining workers, redesigning supply chains, and sometimes even building entirely new infrastructure. That process took time Germany did not always have. Moreover, Nazi ideology played a role in shaping these decisions. Hitler and his top commanders frequently prioritized prestige projects over practicality. They poured resources into advanced but complex weapons like the V-2 rocket or the Tiger tank, technological marvels that were powerful but difficult and expensive to produce at scale. In their pursuit of wonder weapons that could turn the tide of war, they often neglected the brute force simplicity of mass production. Germany built excellent tanks, but not enough of them. It manufactured advanced aircraft, but in numbers too small to gain lasting air superiority. Compounding the problem was the relentless Allied bombing campaign. By the midpoint of the war, Germany's industrial heartland was under constant attack. Bombers targeted railways, fuel refineries, and production centers, forcing factories to scatter and decentralize. This made coordination even more difficult. German industry became a patchwork of isolated facilities, each struggling to maintain output under siege conditions. It was a system that could not adapt quickly, and by the time the Nazis attempted large-scale conversion of civilian industry late in the war, it was too little, too late. Across the Atlantic, the United States had taken a radically different approach, one born out of its unique economic culture and industrial philosophy. American factories were designed from the ground up for flexibility. The same assembly line that produced a family sedan could, with surprisingly few changes, produce a military jeep. A plant that made refrigerators could switch to manufacturing aircraft parts. Even companies with no prior connection to the defense industry found ways to contribute. Toy manufacturers turned out ammunition components. Typewriter companies began building machine guns. Sewing machine factories produced rifle parts. It was a national mobilization on a scale that stunned the world. This was the essence of arsenal democracy, the belief that America's vast and diverse civilian economy could be weaponized for war. It wasn't just about producing weapons, it was about transforming an entire society. Civic pride became a weapon, consumer industries became engines of destruction, and the transformation didn't take years, it often happened in a matter of weeks. One of the most iconic examples of this transformation was Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant in Michigan. Before the war, Ford was best known for mass-producing cars for American families. But by 1942, Willow Run was churning out B-24 Liberator bombers at a rate of one every 63 minutes, an unprecedented achievement in aviation manufacturing. General Motors and Chrysler followed suit, shifting from automobiles to tanks, engines, and other vital components of war. Across the country, similar stories unfolded. Companies that had never touched a weapon before were suddenly producing the tools of global conflict with breathtaking speed. The sheer scale of America's industrial output was staggering. By 1944, the United States was producing 96,000 aircraft per year, more than Germany, Japan, and Italy combined. It was building 8,000 ships annually, from destroyers to aircraft carriers, while also turning out 88,000 tanks and armored vehicles. Many of these weapons came from factories that just a few years earlier had been making household goods or civilian vehicles. And unlike in Germany, this rapid conversion did not cripple the civilian economy. In fact, it revitalized it. War production created millions of jobs, ended the Great Depression, and turned the United States into an economic powerhouse. For German prisoners of war, the scale and speed of this transformation were almost incomprehensible. They came from a system that viewed civilian and military production as separate worlds that could not easily overlap. In America, those worlds were one and the same. A single factory could pivot from consumer goods to war machines almost overnight, and a seemingly ordinary town could become a critical node in the global war effort without missing a beat. The realization was sobering. They had not been defeated merely by superior soldiers or battlefield tactics. They were being overwhelmed by a society that had learned how to weaponize its entire economy. Even more surprising to many of these POWs was the way the American government and private industry worked hand in hand. Agencies like the War Production Board, established in 1942, coordinated the massive shift to war production with remarkable efficiency. They set priorities, allocated materials, and ensured that factories across the nation operated in sync. This collaboration was built not on coercion but on cooperation, a partnership rooted in shared purpose. The relationship between the government and private industry in wartime America was unlike anything the German prisoners had ever seen. In Nazi Germany, industry served the state under strict control and ideological direction. Orders flowed from the top, and companies had little say in how they operated. But in the United States, the dynamic was more collaborative. Major corporations were eager to contribute to the war effort, not just out of patriotism, but also because of the economic opportunities it provided. The War Production Board set the guidelines and priorities, but it often relied on the expertise, innovation, and initiative of private companies to figure out how to meet those demands. It was capitalism redirected toward national survival, and it worked spectacularly well. One of the most powerful symbols of this national mobilization was Rosie the Riveter. With millions of men serving overseas, American factories faced a massive labor shortage. The solution came from an untapped source: women. They flooded into factories in unprecedented numbers, learning trades and skills that had once been considered exclusively male. They welded, machined, assembled, and inspected. They became the backbone of the wartime workforce. This cultural shift did more than just fill labor gaps. It transformed American society. Women gained economic independence, challenged traditional gender roles, and laid the groundwork for future social change. The sight of entire factory floors filled with women in overalls, riveting airplane fuselages or assembling tank engines became one of the defining images of the American home front. Meanwhile, the government coordinated other critical aspects of production beyond the factories themselves. Supply chains were streamlined. Raw materials like steel, aluminum, and rubber were rationed and prioritized for military needs. Railways and shipping networks were reorganized to ensure that finished weapons and vehicles could reach ports and battlefronts with minimal delay. Even seemingly small details, like the standardization of parts across different weapon systems, were carefully planned to increase efficiency and reduce waste. This level of coordination was staggering, and it spoke to a society that had fully embraced the idea of total war. For the German prisoners, the psychological impact of witnessing all this was profound. Many of them had grown up believing that Americans were soft, obsessed with comfort and consumerism, too individualistic to rally together for a common cause. Nazi propaganda painted the United States as decadent and divided, a place where luxury and leisure had dulled the national will. But the reality they saw in wartime America was the opposite. This was a nation that had mobilized its people, its economy, and its ingenuity with astonishing unity and determination. The stereotype of the lazy American collapsed before their eyes. They saw a society where ordinary citizens willingly accepted rationing, bought war bonds, and sent their sons to fight on distant shores, all while working tirelessly to supply the world's largest and most powerful military. The POWs also noticed something else: the sheer scale of America's industrial geography. In Germany, industry was concentrated in a few major regions like the Ruhr Valley or Saxony. That made it both a strength and a vulnerability. In America, industry was everywhere. There were vast steel mills in Pennsylvania, shipyards in California, aircraft plants in Texas, tank factories in Michigan, and munitions plants scattered across the Midwest. Even small towns often had a plant or workshop contributing to the war effort in some way. This geographical spread made the American industrial machine not only larger but more resilient. No single bombing raid could cripple it. No single disaster could halt production. By 1944, the numbers spoke for themselves. The United States was producing more war material than all the Axis powers combined. Its shipyards launched a new vessel every few hours. Its aircraft plants produced planes faster than pilots could be trained to fly them. Its factories churned out tanks, trucks, artillery, ammunition, uniforms, and every other conceivable piece of military equipment on a scale that dwarfed anything Germany could hope to match. The economic output of the United States was so vast that it not only supplied its own military, but also sustained its allies. British armies marched with American-made rifles. Soviet tanks rolled forward with American fuel and food in their supply chains. The Lend-Lease program alone sent more than $50 billion worth of material overseas, a sum that would equal hundreds of billions in today's dollars. To the German prisoners observing all this, one conclusion became inescapable: Germany had lost the war long before the fighting ended. It wasn't just a matter of soldiers or generals. It was a matter of production, logistics, and capacity. The United States had turned its entire society into a weapon, and that weapon was unstoppable. Every car plant, every shipyard, every tool and die shop had become part of a vast, coordinated war effort, and it was this industrial avalanche, more than any single battle or campaign, that sealed the fate of the Third Reich. The contrast with Germany's approach grew even more apparent as the war dragged on. Hitler's regime continued to pursue technologically advanced but resource-intensive weapons programs that drained precious resources without delivering decisive results. The V-2 rocket, for example, was an engineering marvel, the first ballistic missile in history, but each one cost the equivalent of a fighter plane and had little strategic impact. Similarly, the heavy Tiger and Panther tanks were formidable on the battlefield but expensive and slow to produce. American factories, by contrast, churned out thousands of reliable, easy-to-produce Sherman tanks. They weren't as individually powerful as the German machines, but there were so many of them that they overwhelmed the enemy by sheer numbers. This philosophy, quantity with sufficient quality, extended to every aspect of American production. Aircraft like the P-51 Mustang, B-17 Flying Fortress, and B-29 Superfortress were built in vast numbers, giving the Allies overwhelming air superiority. The Liberty ships, quickly and cheaply produced by American shipyards, became the backbone of Allied logistics. Trucks and jeeps produced by the millions kept armies supplied and mobile across continents. Even mundane items like boots, uniforms, and field rations were produced on a scale that ensured American soldiers were consistently better equipped and better supplied than their adversaries. And this industrial juggernaut did not stop at the borders of the United States. American production capacity became a global force multiplier. In North Africa, it kept British forces moving. In the Soviet Union, it provided food, vehicles, and materials that kept the Red Army in the fight. In the Pacific, it built the fleets and air forces that rolled back Japanese expansion. Everywhere the Axis. Powers turned, they faced not just the United States Army or Navy, they faced the full weight of American industry. For the POWs, these realizations were more than just abstract facts. They were deeply personal. Many of them had worked in factories before the war, and they knew firsthand how difficult it was to retool production lines or ramp up output. To see an entire nation do it on a scale, orders of magnitude greater than anything they had experienced, was both awe-inspiring and demoralizing. It forced them to confront uncomfortable truths about their own country's failures, not just on the battlefield, but in its fundamental approach to war. Some prisoners even wrote about these revelations in their diaries and memoirs after the war. They described their shock at learning that a refrigerator plant in Ohio could build aircraft engines, or that a sewing machine company in New Jersey was producing machine gun parts. They wrote about the pride and unity they saw in the American workforce, the sense of shared purpose that transcended class, gender, and background. And they admitted that this, more than any weapon or general, was the real reason Germany could not win. As the war moved toward its final and most decisive stages, the overwhelming industrial capacity of the United States began to manifest itself not just in the numbers on production charts, but in the realities of the battlefield. German soldiers, those who had once laughed at the idea of American softness, now faced an enemy that seemed to have an endless supply of men, machines, and munitions. On the Eastern Front, Soviet divisions rolled westward with fleets of U.S.-made trucks and jeeps ferrying troops and supplies. In North Africa and Italy, British and Commonwealth units were armed with American artillery and supported by American-built aircraft. Across the Pacific, island after island fell as U.S. carrier task forces, built in American shipyards at a pace Japan could never match, projected overwhelming power across thousands of miles of ocean. And in Western Europe, the skies themselves were dominated by swarms of American bombers and fighters, so numerous that the Luftwaffe was stretched thin trying to intercept them. The psychological weight of this relentless production began to crush German morale. Prisoners of war who had believed the Reich could hold out for a negotiated peace now saw the truth. There would be no bargaining with a nation that could simply outproduce them into submission. Every tank destroyed by a German anti-tank gun was replaced by two more. Every aircraft shot down by flak or fighter was quickly replaced on the next bombing raid. Every convoy sunk by a U-boat was followed by another, larger convoy, often escorted by ships fresh from American shipyards. It was a war of attrition, but one fought not just with soldiers but with factories. And in that war, the United States was untouchable. What struck many German observers most was the way American production capacity translated directly into battlefield flexibility. In previous wars, logistics often limited strategic options. Armies could only advance as far as their supply lines allowed. Replacements and reinforcements were slow to arrive. Equipment shortages could halt offensives for weeks or months. But the American war machine changed that calculus. New units could be raised, trained, equipped, and shipped overseas with astonishing speed. Vast reserves of material meant that generals could plan operations without worrying about running out of tanks or artillery shells. And if a campaign bogged down, new resources could be thrown into the fight until it broke through. This industrial depth gave Allied commanders an advantage that was as psychological as it was material. They could fight with boldness, knowing that the full weight of the American economy was behind them. This advantage was not lost on the Axis High Command. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, later admitted that once America's industrial potential was fully mobilized, Germany's defeat was inevitable. In his memoirs, Speer reflected that the Reich had underestimated the American economy, failing to grasp how quickly and completely it could be redirected toward war. Even if Germany had captured Moscow or forced Britain to the negotiating table, the sheer industrial might of the United States would have eventually turned the tide. The war, he concluded, was no longer just a contest of armies. It was a contest of production systems, and America's system was unbeatable. For the German POWs who witnessed all of this firsthand, the experience left a lasting impression. Many would later say that their captivity in the United States opened their eyes not just to the scale of America's economy, but to the cultural values that made it possible. They saw a society that valued innovation, rewarded efficiency, and encouraged problem-solving at every level. They observed workers who took pride in their labor and managers who were willing to experiment and adapt. They saw how competition between companies drove constant improvement and how collaboration between business and government created a synergy that Germany's top-down command economy could not replicate. The war was fought with guns and tanks, but it was won with ideas about how a society should organize itself to meet a crisis. The POWs were also struck by the contrast in how ordinary Americans experienced the war compared to their own families back home. In Germany, civilians had endured relentless bombing, food shortages, and strict rationing. The war felt like an all-consuming catastrophe. In the United States, while rationing and sacrifices certainly existed, the home front was far more stable. Factories ran around the clock, producing not just for the military but often still meeting civilian needs. Families could still enjoy relative comfort. Entertainment, culture, and consumer goods continued to thrive. This stability was itself a strategic advantage. It meant that American workers could focus on production without the psychological burden of constant fear and deprivation. It also meant that the war effort enjoyed broad public support that never wavered, even during the darkest days of the conflict. The German prisoners' sense of shock deepened when they realized that this immense industrial effort was not even using the United States' full potential. Despite producing more war material than any other country in history, the U.S. economy continued to grow. Consumer spending remained strong, agricultural output soared, scientific research flourished, and even with millions of men serving overseas, unemployment remained low. This was not a nation straining to its limits. It was a nation harnessing its vast capacity and discovering that its limits were far beyond what anyone had imagined. Many German POWs would later admit that their captivity in America fundamentally changed how they thought about their own country's future. After the war, some of them went on to work in West Germany's post-war reconstruction efforts, carrying with them the lessons they had learned about American industry and organization. They understood that the future of their nation would depend not just on rebuilding factories, but on creating a more flexible, innovative, and collaborative economic system. In this way, the shock they felt as prisoners of war would echo far beyond the war itself, influencing the very structure of the new German state. But perhaps the most humbling realization for these men was this: America's industrial miracle was not the result of desperation or authoritarian control. It was the product of a free society, one that thrived on individual initiative and collective effort alike. It was proof that democracy, often derided by Nazi propaganda as weak and chaotic, could in fact marshal its resources more effectively than any dictatorship. It was a lesson in the strength of a system that trusted its people, and a warning to those who believed that tyranny was the only path to power. This realization was not lost on the American people either. The war had shown them what their economy could do when fully mobilized. It had proven that the United States could rise to any challenge, no matter how vast. That confidence would shape the post-war world, fueling decades of economic expansion and technological innovation. And it would lay the foundation for a new kind of power, one based not just on military strength, but on the ability to project economic and industrial might on a global scale. When the war finally ended in 1945, the United States stood in a position of strength unprecedented in human history. Its cities had not been bombed into rubble, its factories had not been destroyed by enemy aircraft. Its infrastructure remained intact, and its economy, far from being drained by the conflict, had been supercharged by it. While Europe lay in ruins and Japan struggled to recover from atomic devastation, America emerged not only as a military victor, but as the undisputed economic powerhouse of the modern world. It was producing over half of the world's industrial output, controlling vast reserves of wealth and supplying the goods, machinery, and technology that would rebuild entire continents. For many German prisoners of war, the contrast between their homeland's destruction and America's thriving industrial landscape was impossible to ignore. Their own cities, Hamburg, Berlin, Dresden, were piles of rubble. Rail networks were shattered, fuel reserves depleted, and production lines reduced to twisted steel and ash. Yet in the United States, the same factories that had built tanks and planes during the war were now seamlessly returning to civilian production, churning out cars, refrigerators, and consumer goods for a nation eager to enjoy the fruits of peace. It was as if America had flipped a switch, war one day, prosperity the next, and the speed and ease with which it made that transition left many Europeans in disbelief. This post-war transformation underscored a deeper truth about America's wartime industrial miracle. It had not been a temporary surge, but a demonstration of enduring capacity. The systems, technologies, and organizational methods developed during the war would become permanent fixtures of the U.S. economy. The partnership between government and industry, forged in the crucible of global conflict, would continue long after the guns fell silent. Military contracts would keep factories humming. Research and development, once focused on weapons, would now fuel innovations in aviation, electronics, and communications. The same industrial base that had defeated the Axis would soon launch satellites into orbit and land men on the moon. This seamless transition marked the birth of what President Dwight D. Eisenhower would later call the military-industrial complex, a vast network of defense contractors, government agencies, and private companies whose influence would shape U.S. policy for decades. Eisenhower, a former general himself, warned in his 1961 farewell address of the potential dangers of this system, cautioning that its immense power could distort national priorities if left unchecked. Yet there was no denying its effectiveness. The same mechanisms that had produced Liberty ships and Sherman tanks now produced jet bombers and intercontinental ballistic missiles. The lessons learned during World War II about mass production, supply chains, and technological integration became the foundation of America's Cold War strategy. For the German POWs who had witnessed the American industrial machine firsthand, this evolution was further proof of the fundamental differences between the two nations' approaches to power. Germany's war economy had been built for conquest, focused on short-term goals, driven by ideology, and often sabotaged by internal rivalries and inefficiencies. America's economy, by contrast, was built for longevity. It was flexible, adaptable, and deeply intertwined with the broader fabric of society. It did not need to be dismantled after the war. It could simply shift its focus and continue operating at full speed. The long-term consequences of this system were profound. In the decades that followed World War II, the United States became not only the arsenal of democracy, but also the engine of global capitalism. Its factories supplied the machinery that rebuilt Europe under the Marshall Plan. Its consumer goods filled stores from London to Tokyo. Its automobiles, airplanes, and electronics set global standards. And its cultural exports, from Hollywood films to jazz music, projected American influence far beyond the reach of its military bases. The same industrial might that had humbled the German prisoners of war now shaped the very structure of the post-war world. But the story of America's wartime production miracle is more than a story of steel and assembly lines. At its core, it is a story about people, about millions of ordinary citizens who rose to meet an extraordinary challenge. It is about the engineers who redesigned factories to build new weapons in record time, the workers who pulled double shifts to keep production lines running, the women who stepped into roles society had told them they could not fill and then excelled in them, the immigrants who brought fresh ideas and skills to the effort, and the farmers, miners, truck drivers, and railroad workers who ensured that raw materials flowed where they were needed most. Together, they proved that a free, democratic society could mobilize for war with a speed and efficiency that no dictatorship could match. The experience also reshaped how Americans saw themselves. Before World War II, the United States had been a nation still grappling with the aftershocks of the Great Depression. Isolationist sentiment was strong, and many doubted whether the country could, or should, play a major role on the global stage. By 1945, those doubts had vanished. The war had proven not only America's military strength, but also its capacity for leadership. It had demonstrated that the nation could unite behind a common purpose and achieve feats that once seemed impossible. That confidence became part of the American identity, fueling a sense of destiny and responsibility that would define its role in the 20th century. For the German prisoners who had once looked down on the United States as a land of softness and excess, these lessons were humbling. Many of them would later speak of their time in captivity as a turning point, a moment when they began to question the assumptions they had grown up with. They came to understand that strength was not just a matter of discipline or ideology. It was also a matter of creativity, adaptability, and the ability to harness the talents of an entire society. They saw that the true measure of a nation's power was not how many tanks it could build in a vacuum, but how quickly and effectively it could turn its whole economy toward a common goal. Some German POWs even admitted that they felt a sense of admiration for the United States, and in some cases, gratitude. They had been treated humanely during their captivity, given food and medical care, and even allowed to work on farms and in factories. They had seen a side of America that was generous and just, even toward its enemies. And they had witnessed firsthand the values, freedom, innovation, collaboration, that underpinned its astonishing industrial achievements. These experiences would stay with them long after they returned home, influencing how they thought about democracy, capitalism, and the future of their own country. The influence of those revelations stretched far beyond the individual lives of the German POWs. In the decades following the war, as West Germany rebuilt itself from the ashes of defeat, many of the principles they had witnessed in the United States quietly informed the nation's transformation into an economic powerhouse. The post-war Wirtschaftswunder, or economic miracle, that turned West Germany into one of the world's leading industrial nations was not just a triumph of reconstruction, it was a conscious reimagining of how an economy should function. Flexibility, innovation, and cooperation between government and industry, lessons learned in part from observing the American model, became central to the new German approach. The rigid, centralized, top-down systems of the Nazi era were discarded in favor of a more adaptive, collaborative structure. It was a kind of institutional humility born from defeat and observation. The German POWs, who had once stared in disbelief at American factories turning out planes and tanks, now returned to a country that had been forced to confront its own limitations. And as West Germany rose from ruin, many of those men contributed directly to its rebirth. Some took jobs in newly rebuilt industries, applying ideas they had seen in the United States to improve efficiency and output. Others became engineers, managers, or policymakers, bringing with them a fresh understanding of how a modern industrial economy could function. The irony was profound. The very system that had once humbled Germany on the battlefield now helped shape its resurgence as a peaceful and prosperous democracy. Meanwhile, the rest of the world watched and learned as well. The Soviet Union, America's new rival in the Cold War, poured enormous resources into replicating the United States model of industrial mobilization. The concept of total war, of harnessing the full capacity of a nation's economy for military purposes, became a defining feature of 20th century geopolitics. Nations realized that wars were no longer won solely by the bravery of soldiers or the brilliance of generals, but by the factories, supply chains, and logistical systems that stood behind them. It was a lesson first demonstrated in dramatic fashion during World War II and one that shaped military strategy for decades to come. Even in peacetime, the lessons of America's wartime industrial miracle continued to influence global events. When the Korean War broke out in 1950, the United States was able to ramp up production almost immediately, supplying not only its own forces but also those of its allies. During the Vietnam War, vast quantities of material flowed into Southeast Asia, sustained by an industrial base that had been built and perfected during the 1940s. And during the Cold War arms race, America's ability to outproduce the Soviet Union in everything from missiles to microchips proved decisive in maintaining its strategic edge. The legacy of that wartime mobilization was not just a one-time achievement. It was a blueprint for sustained global power. Back in Germany, the memory of the war and of the overwhelming American production machine remained vivid. Many POWs spoke of their experiences with a mixture of awe and introspection. They remembered the conversations they'd had with American guards and factory workers, the tours they'd taken of industrial plants, the stunned silence they'd shared as they watched vast assembly lines turning out weapons faster than they could count them. They spoke of the sense of inevitability that set in as they realized that no matter how hard Germany fought, it could not keep pace with such an enemy. And they reflected on the profound difference in mindset that had made it possible, a mindset that saw change not as a threat but as an opportunity, that valued practicality over prestige, and that understood the power of unity in a time of crisis. The contrast with the Nazi worldview could not have been more stark. The regime's obsession with ideological purity, its disdain for decadent democracies, and its fixation on technological showpieces had blinded it to the realities of modern warfare. Germany had pursued perfection, while America had pursued production. Germany had built weapons to impress, while America had built weapons to win. And in the end, it was the latter approach that prevailed. This realization was humbling for many Germans, but it was also enlightening. It forced them to reconsider deeply held assumptions about strength, efficiency, and national purpose. Some former POWs even spoke about the profound cultural differences they observed, differences that went beyond factories and production lines. They noticed, for example, the way American society valued collaboration and problem-solving. When a factory faced a production bottleneck, workers and managers often brainstormed solutions together, regardless of rank or status. When a new challenge arose, companies quickly adapted, retooling their lines or experimenting with new processes. There was a sense of fluidity and openness that contrasted sharply with the rigid hierarchies and inflexible systems they had known in Germany. This cultural mindset, they realized, was just as important to America's success as its physical resources. The POW experience also exposed them to another crucial element of America's wartime success, its ability to inspire its people with a sense of shared purpose. They saw how propaganda, far from the hateful, fear-driven rhetoric of Nazi Germany, focused on unity, duty, and sacrifice. Posters and films encouraged citizens to conserve resources, buy war bonds, and support the troops. Celebrities and public figures promoted the war effort, and communities organized scrap drives and blood donations. The entire nation seemed to be moving in the same direction, driven by a collective belief that their cause was just and their victory inevitable. It was a demonstration of democratic mobilization at its finest, a society not coerced into action but inspired to act. For the POWs, these experiences were transformative. Many entered captivity convinced that their country was destined to dominate the world. that its military prowess and industrial base were unmatched. They left with a very different perspective, one that recognized the immense power of a free society mobilized for war. They came to see that democracy was not a weakness but a strength, that diversity and debate could lead to innovation and resilience, and that individual freedom could coexist with collective purpose. It was a lesson that would shape their understanding of the world for the rest of their lives. And yet, perhaps the most profound impact of all was the sense of humility that grew from these revelations. For many German prisoners, the war had been a story of shattered illusions, illusions about their country's strength, about the nature of power, and about the supposed superiority of authoritarian systems. In America, they saw those illusions replaced by a more complex, nuanced understanding of how nations rise and fall. They saw that power is not just a matter of guns and armies, but of factories and workers, ideas and institutions, values and beliefs. And they understood often for the first time that the real strength of a nation lies not in its capacity to destroy, but in its capacity to build. As the decades passed and the memories of World War II slowly faded, the lessons it had taught about industrial capacity, adaptability, and national will remained deeply embedded in the strategies of the world's leading powers. Nowhere was this more evident than in the Cold War, a conflict fought not just with weapons and armies, but with economies, technologies, and production systems. Once again, the United States' ability to mobilize its industrial base proved to be one of its greatest strengths. And once again, the echoes of those astonished German POWs reverberated through history as America's factories, laboratories, and shipyards continued to shape the balance of global power. The Cold War was, in many ways, a contest of production. The United States and the Soviet Union raced to build not only larger and more advanced arsenals of nuclear weapons, but also the delivery systems, command infrastructures, and defensive technologies to support them. Each side sought to outproduce the other in tanks, submarines, aircraft, and missiles. And beyond the battlefield, the competition extended into space, with both nations pouring resources into launching satellites, landing probes on distant planets, and, ultimately, putting humans into orbit and onto the moon. This was an arms race unlike any the world had ever seen, and once again, the United States' flexible and innovation-driven industrial model proved decisive. What made the American system so effective was its ability to continuously adapt. The same qualities that had allowed car factories to become bomber plants in 1942 now enabled them to shift to producing jet engines, missile components, and advanced electronics in the 1950s and 1960s. Private companies that had once built tanks now worked on space capsules. Research labs that had focused on wartime radar now turned their attention to computers and satellites. And the partnership between government, industry, and academia, forged during the war, became even stronger, producing breakthroughs in science and technology that would transform not only warfare, but everyday life. From microchips to jet propulsion, from nuclear power to satellite communication, many of the defining technologies of the 20th century were direct descendants of wartime industrial innovation. The Soviet Union, for its part, also mobilized enormous industrial resources in its pursuit of global influence. But its centrally planned economy often struggled with inefficiency, waste, and technological stagnation. Factories were massive but inflexible, and innovation was frequently stifled by bureaucracy and political interference. The result was a system that could produce vast quantities of material, but often lagged behind in quality and sophistication. The contrast with the American model, dynamic, competitive, and deeply interconnected with civilian industry, was striking. Over time, this gap became a decisive factor in the Cold War. The United States could not only build more, but build better, producing technologies that gave it a strategic edge across multiple domains. The lessons of World War II also shaped American military doctrine during this period. Leaders understood that wars would likely be won or lost not on the battlefield alone, but in the factories, laboratories, and supply chains that supported the fighting forces. As a result, great emphasis was placed on maintaining a robust and diversified industrial base, one capable of rapidly scaling up in the event of conflict. Even during peacetime, defense contracts ensured that key industries remained active, that skilled workers stayed employed, and that vital production capabilities were not lost. This constant state of readiness, a legacy of the wartime mobilization effort, gave the United States a strategic advantage that few nations could match. This mindset also influenced America's foreign policy. The Marshall Plan, for example, was not just an act of generosity. It was a strategic investment in creating a global economic order that supported American industry and political influence. By helping to rebuild Western Europe and Japan, the United States created strong trading partners and allies who would buy its goods, share its technologies, and align with its strategic objectives. The result was a global network of economic interdependence that reinforced America's industrial and political power. In many ways, the factories that had built tanks and planes in the 1940s were now building the foundations of a new world order. The German POWs, who had once marveled at America's wartime production, would not have been surprised by this outcome. They had seen firsthand the raw power of a society that could turn its entire economy toward a single goal. They had witnessed the cultural and institutional strengths, innovation, collaboration, adaptability that underpinned that power. And they had come to understand that these strengths were not temporary or situational. They were woven into the very fabric of American society. The Cold War merely confirmed what they had learned in captivity, that the United States' greatest weapon was not its army or its navy, but its ability to mobilize its people and its industries in pursuit of a common purpose. This industrial dominance also had profound implications for American society itself. The constant demand for new technologies spurred innovation and drove economic growth. Entire new industries, from aerospace to computing, emerged from the infrastructure built to support the military. Universities expanded their engineering and science programs, producing a new generation of skilled workers and researchers. The federal government invested heavily in research and development, funding projects that would lead to breakthroughs in medicine, materials science, energy, and more. The result was a feedback loop. Military needs drove technological innovation, which in turn fueled economic growth and created new capabilities for both civilian and defense industries. Yet, there was a darker side to this transformation as well. The vast scale of the military-industrial complex raised concerns about its influence on politics and society. Critics argued that the constant demand for new weapons and technologies risked entrenching a permanent state of militarization. They warned that the close ties between government and industry could lead to corruption, inefficiency, and an overemphasis on military solutions to global problems. Eisenhower's warning about the potential dangers of the military-industrial complex was a reflection of these fears, a reminder that the same system that had helped win World War II could, if unchecked, distort democratic institutions and priorities. Even so, the fundamental lesson remained unchanged. Industrial capacity, adaptability, and innovation were the bedrock of national power. The astonishment of those German prisoners, their disbelief that a refrigerator factory could build airplane engines, that a sewing machine company could produce machine guns, had captured a deeper truth about the modern world. Power no longer belonged solely to those who could field the largest armies or control the most territory. It belonged to those who could harness the full potential of their societies, their economies, their technologies, their people, in pursuit of a shared goal. As the Cold War continued to define the second half of the 20th century, the principles that had so astonished German POWs during World War II continued to guide American strategy. Nowhere was this more evident than in the conflicts that followed, particularly in Korea, Vietnam, and the Persian Gulf. In each of these wars, the United States relied not only on its military strength, but also on its unparalleled ability to mobilize industrial and technological resources to sustain long and complex campaigns. These conflicts demonstrated that America's wartime lessons had not been forgotten. Instead, they had become an integral part of how the nation projected power around the world. The Korean War, which erupted in 1950, was the first major test of America's post-war industrial capacity. Less than 5 years after the end of World War II, the United States found itself once again mobilizing for conflict, and it did so with remarkable speed. Factories that had returned to civilian production were quickly retooled to produce tanks, aircraft, and ammunition. New weapon systems were developed and deployed in record time. And, crucially, America's vast logistical infrastructure ensured that troops on the Korean Peninsula were consistently supplied with the equipment and provisions they needed. For a nation that had demobilized millions of soldiers and scaled back wartime production, the rapid return to a war footing was a powerful demonstration of industrial flexibility. The Vietnam War, though far more controversial and politically divisive, further highlighted the enduring strength of America's industrial base. Over the course of the conflict, the United States deployed thousands of aircraft, millions of tons of bombs, and an enormous array of vehicles, weapons, and support equipment. The sheer scale of the logistical operation was staggering. Supplies flowed across the Pacific in an unending stream, supporting not only U.S. forces but also those of South Vietnam and other allies. At the height of the war, American industry was producing vast quantities of materiel while still sustaining a booming civilian economy at home. The ability to fight a major overseas conflict without crippling domestic production was something no other nation on Earth could match. But Vietnam also exposed the limits of industrial power when it was not matched by clear strategy and public support. Despite its overwhelming material advantages, the United States struggled to achieve its objectives in Southeast Asia. The lesson was sobering. Production alone could not guarantee victory. Yet even in defeat, the war underscored the central role of industrial might in modern warfare. Without America's vast manufacturing capacity, the conflict would have been impossible to sustain for more than a decade. By the time of the Persian Gulf War in 1991, the full potential of America's wartime lessons was on display once again, but in a dramatically different form. The conflict, triggered by Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, was short, intense, and technologically sophisticated. It was a war fought as much with precision-guided missiles and stealth aircraft as with tanks and infantry. And behind every bomb dropped, every tank deployed, and every satellite-guided operation was the immense industrial and technological infrastructure of the United States. Factories across the country produced the advanced weapons systems that define the conflict: Tomahawk cruise missiles, M1 Abrams tanks, F-117 stealth fighters, and Patriot missile batteries. American companies supplied the communications networks, satellite systems, and logistical capabilities that allowed coalition forces to coordinate operations on a global scale. The rapid deployment of hundreds of thousands of troops and vast amounts of equipment halfway around the world, and their equally rapid withdrawal after victory, was a logistical achievement unmatched in history. The Gulf War was a vivid reminder that the lessons of World War II still mattered. The ability to mobilize a nation's full industrial and technological capacity remained a decisive factor in modern warfare. These conflicts also reflected another evolution of the American model: the integration of civilian and military technologies. Many of the most important innovations of the late 20th century, from microprocessors to satellite navigation, had their roots in defense research and production. These technologies, in turn, fueled advances in civilian industries, creating a cycle of innovation that strengthened the economy and enhanced military capabilities simultaneously. The synergy between civilian and defense sectors, a hallmark of the American approach since the 1940s, became one of the nation's greatest strategic assets. Meanwhile, the rest of the world continued to absorb the lessons of America's wartime experience. In Europe, NATO allies built their own industrial capacities, often modeled on the flexible, collaborative systems pioneered by the United States. Japan, which had once waged war against America, adopted similar principles during its post-war economic miracle, building a highly efficient industrial base that could adapt to changing demands. Even in the Soviet Union, where central planning remained dominant, efforts were made to introduce greater flexibility and technological innovation into the defense sector, though these efforts were often hampered by political and bureaucratic obstacles. By the end of the 20th century, the central lesson that had stunned those German POWs in the 1940s was clearer than ever. In the modern world, the line between civilian and military production had blurred almost completely. National power was no longer measured solely by the size of armies or the number of weapons in a country's arsenal. It was measured by the depth and flexibility of its industrial base, the speed with which it could adapt to new challenges, and the creativity of the people who operated it. In this new reality, the ability to convert a factory from building consumer goods to producing advanced weapons was not just a wartime advantage, it was a fundamental element of global power. And yet, despite all the technological advances and strategic lessons learned over decades of conflict, the core truth that had so shocked those German prisoners remained unchanged. It was not the tanks or planes themselves that had won World War II. It was the capacity to build them, and to build them faster, cheaper, and in greater numbers than the enemy. It was the ability to harness the ingenuity of a free people, the dynamism of a market economy, and the organizational power of a democratic government. That combination had been decisive in 1945, and it remained decisive more than half a century later. As the world entered the 21st century, the nature of warfare and global competition began to change in profound ways. The battlefields of the new era were not always defined by tanks and trenches, but by information, technology, and economics. Cyber attacks could cripple nations without a single shot being fired. Global supply chains stretched across continents, linking economies in ways unimaginable in 1945. Terrorist groups, rather than traditional nation-states, posed major security threats. Yet even in this radically transformed landscape, the fundamental lessons of World War II, the same ones that had astonished German POWs, continued to shape American strategy and power. At the heart of those lessons was the principle of adaptability. In a world defined by rapid technological change, the ability to repurpose and reorient industrial and technological capacity remained a decisive advantage. This was evident in the immediate aftermath of the September 11, 2001 attacks. Within weeks, U.S. defense contractors and technology companies pivoted toward developing new surveillance systems, unmanned drones, and intelligence-gathering tools. Agencies like the Department of Homeland Security were created almost overnight, integrating resources from across the government. The speed of this transformation, reminiscent of the rapid mobilization of 1942, was a testament to America's continued capacity for large-scale, coordinated action. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq further illustrated how deeply the legacy of World War II production still influenced modern military operations. The U.S. military deployed vast fleets of vehicles, aircraft, and ships to theaters thousands of miles from home, sustaining complex supply chains that stretched across oceans and continents. Private industry played a critical role, not only in producing weapons and equipment, but also in providing logistics, communications, and infrastructure support. The same collaborative model that had defined wartime production in the 1940s, a partnership between government, industry, and the public, continued to underpin America's global military presence. But the lessons of the past were not confined to the battlefield. They were equally relevant in peacetime crises, perhaps most dramatically illustrated during the COVID-19 pandemic. In early 2020, as the virus spread rapidly across the globe, governments everywhere faced a daunting challenge: how to rapidly produce and distribute critical supplies like ventilators, masks, and vaccines. Once again, the United States turned to the principle that had defined its wartime success: industrial conversion. Automobile companies pivoted to manufacturing medical equipment. Textile manufacturers produced personal protective gear. Pharmaceutical companies, often rivals, collaborated on vaccine development at unprecedented speed. And the federal government coordinated distribution networks on a scale reminiscent of wartime logistics. The parallels with World War II were striking. Just as factories had once switched from producing consumer goods to tanks and bombers, they now shifted from cars and clothing to life-saving medical devices. Just as the War Production Board had orchestrated the flow of resources during the 1940s, modern agencies worked to prioritize critical materials and streamline supply chains. And just as the American public had rallied behind the war effort, citizens and private companies alike mobilized to combat the pandemic. It was a vivid reminder that the capacity to repurpose an economy, to transform it almost overnight, remained one of the most powerful tools a nation could possess. The rise of new strategic domains, such as cybersecurity and artificial intelligence, has only reinforced the importance of this lesson. Nations today compete not just over physical resources, but over data, algorithms, and technological ecosystems. In this environment, the ability to innovate quickly, to adapt industries and research institutions to emerging challenges, is every bit as crucial as the ability to build ships or aircraft. Once again, the United States' flexible, decentralized, and innovation-driven industrial model gives it a significant edge. Tech companies that once focused on consumer applications now develop cutting-edge defense technologies. Startups pivot from commercial ventures to national security projects. Research universities work closely with government agencies to advance breakthroughs in quantum computing, machine learning, and space exploration. The underlying principle is the same one that German POWs found so astonishing in the 1940s: the capacity to shift focus and mobilize resources at will. This adaptability also shapes the global balance of power in the 21st century. As geopolitical competition intensifies, particularly between the United States and China, industrial and technological capacity once again sits at the heart of strategic rivalry. China has invested heavily in building a robust industrial base, seeking to match or surpass the U.S. in key sectors like semiconductors, artificial intelligence, and renewable energy. But the United States retains a critical advantage: a culture of innovation, a network of alliances, and a flexible economic system that can respond to challenges more rapidly and creatively. It is the same advantage that allowed it to outproduce Nazi Germany in the 1940s, and it remains a decisive factor today. The importance of supply chains, too, echoes the lessons of the past. During World War II, America's vast domestic resources and industrial networks allowed it to produce and transport war material on a scale unmatched by any adversary. In today's globalized economy, control over supply chains, from rare earth minerals to microchips, plays a similarly strategic role. Disruptions can cripple entire industries and undermine national security. Recognizing this, the United States has begun to invest heavily in reshoring key industries, diversifying supply sources, and strengthening domestic production capabilities. Once again, the guiding principle is the same. A strong, adaptable industrial base is the foundation of national power. And while the threats of the 21st century may look very different from those of 1941, the underlying realities remain unchanged. Whether confronting a global pandemic, a cyber attack, or a strategic rival, the nations best equipped to respond are those that can mobilize quickly, innovate relentlessly, and coordinate effectively across public and private sectors. These were the qualities that stunned German POWs during World War II. They are the qualities that continue to define American power today. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this continuity is how deeply it is woven into the American identity. The belief that a free society can rise to meet any challenge, that ordinary people, working together, can achieve extraordinary things, has become a central part of the national story. It is a belief born in the factories and shipyards of the 1940s, forged in the fires of a global conflict, and reaffirmed in every crisis since. And it is a belief that continues to inspire confidence, not only in America's capacity to defend itself, but also in its ability to shape the future. The ripple effects of America's industrial adaptability go beyond its borders. They shape alliances, influence global governance, and underpin the very structure of the international order. Just as the United States industrial might supplied the Allied armies during World War II, today it sustains a vast network of partnerships and coalitions that rely on American production, technology, and logistical capabilities. These alliances are not merely political or military. They are deeply economic and industrial in nature, and they reflect the enduring truth that power in the modern world is built not only on armies and treaties, but on the capacity to build, supply, and sustain. Take NATO, for example. Since its founding in 1949, the alliance has relied heavily on American industrial capacity. U.S. factories produce much of the advanced weaponry, aircraft, and support systems that form the backbone of NATO's collective defense. American logistics capabilities, from strategic airlift to naval supply chains, enable rapid deployment of forces across continents. And American research and development drive innovations that benefit the entire alliance, from missile defense systems to secure communications networks. This industrial support is a critical reason why NATO remains the most formidable military coalition in history. It is not just a matter of shared values or strategic interests, it is a matter of shared capacity, built on the foundation of America's wartime legacy. The same dynamic plays out in America's relationships across the Pacific. Countries like Japan, South Korea, and Australia depend on U.S. technological and industrial leadership to maintain their own security and economic competitiveness. American defense contractors supply aircraft, ships, and missile systems that form key components of their militaries. Joint research projects develop cutting-edge technologies, from hypersonic weapons to next-generation fighter jets. And perhaps most importantly, American supply chains and manufacturing networks provide a level of resilience and reliability that many nations cannot achieve on their own. This interdependence reinforces alliances and strengthens America's global influence, creating a web of cooperation that extends far beyond the battlefield. This global industrial network also serves a deterrent function. Potential adversaries must consider not just America's military strength, but the vast economic and industrial machinery that supports it. They must calculate not only the immediate balance of forces, but also the long-term capacity of the United States and its allies to sustain a conflict. This was precisely the miscalculation that doomed Nazi Germany, a miscalculation born of underestimating the American industrial engine. And it remains a central challenge for any nation contemplating confrontation with the United States today. For many historians, this industrial dimension of power is one of the most underappreciated aspects of international relations. Diplomacy, ideology, and military might often dominate discussions of geopolitics, but behind all of these lies the question of capacity. Can a nation produce enough ships to patrol its waters, enough aircraft to defend its skies, enough microchips to power its communications networks, enough fuel, food, and ammunition to sustain its forces in the field? The answers to these questions are not determined solely by strategy or leadership. They are determined by industry, logistics, and the ability to mobilize a nation's resources. And in this arena, the United States has enjoyed a commanding advantage for more than 8 decades. This advantage is not static, however. It must be maintained through constant investment, innovation, and adaptation. The same qualities that enabled the United States to outproduce Nazi Germany must be nurtured in the 21st century if the country is to remain a global leader. That means investing in infrastructure, supporting advanced manufacturing, and fostering collaboration between government, industry, and academia. It means training a workforce capable of operating in increasingly complex technological environments. And it means ensuring that the industrial base is resilient in the face of disruptions, whether those disruptions come from pandemics, cyber attacks, or geopolitical tensions. The importance of this continued investment becomes even clearer when one considers the psychological dimension of power, a dimension that those German POWs understood all too well. The sight of America's industrial might during World War II did more than just reveal a material advantage. It sent a powerful message that the United States was a nation capable of achieving the impossible. That message, perhaps more than any weapon or battle, broke the morale of many who witnessed it. They realized that they were not just fighting soldiers. They were fighting an entire society, one that could transform itself almost overnight into a war machine of unprecedented scale. That psychological shock reverberated through the ranks of the German military and into the halls of Nazi leadership, where it contributed to a growing sense of inevitability about the war's outcome. The same psychological dynamic continues to shape global perceptions of American power today. When adversaries consider challenging the United States, they must reckon with more than just its current capabilities. They must consider its potential, its ability to scale, adapt, and innovate under pressure. They must consider the possibility that a society capable of mobilizing to build 96,000 aircraft in a single year during the 1940s could, if necessary, achieve similar feats in the 21st century, albeit with different tools and technologies. This perception itself serves as a deterrent, a reminder that American power is not fixed but expandable, and that any attempt to match it would require not just courage, but extraordinary capacity. At the same time, this psychological legacy inspires America's allies and partners. Just as the German POWs were astonished by the speed and scale of American mobilization, so too are many nations reassured by it today. They know that in times of crisis, the United States has the ability and the will to surge resources, deploy capabilities, and sustain long campaigns if necessary. This trust is a cornerstone of alliances, underpinning collective security arrangements and encouraging cooperation on a global scale. It is part of what makes American leadership credible, not just promises or policies, but the demonstrated capacity to deliver when it matters most. The enduring lesson, then, is that industrial power is not merely a technical or economic concept. It is a strategic, diplomatic, and psychological force. It shapes alliances, deters adversaries, and influences the course of history. It is the invisible scaffolding upon which global power is built, and it remains, as it was in 1945, one of the United States' greatest strategic advantages. The story of America's wartime industrial miracle is not only one of factories, weapons, and production lines, it is also a story of cultural transformation. The ability to mobilize a nation's entire economy for war reshaped the United States from the inside out, altering its society, values, and identity in ways that continue to resonate to this day. The astonishment of German POWs was not only about the sheer number of tanks and planes being produced, but about the spirit of the society that made such production possible. And in understanding that spirit, we begin to see how the experience of World War II fundamentally changed what it meant to be American. One of the most profound changes was in the relationship between government, industry, and the public. Before the war, many Americans were skeptical of large federal programs and wary of government intervention in the economy. The Great Depression had begun to shift this mindset, but it was the war that solidified a new consensus. That government, when working in partnership with private enterprise and civil society, could be a powerful force for good. The War Production Board's success in coordinating industry, the military, and labor unions showed that complex national challenges could be met through collective effort. This collaborative model became a blueprint for future national projects, from the space race to the interstate highway system, to the creation of the Internet. The war also transformed the American workforce. The mass mobilization for production drew millions of people into jobs that had previously been closed to them. Women, in particular, entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, proving their ability to excel in fields once dominated by men. Rosie the Riveter was more than a propaganda icon. She was a symbol of a fundamental societal shift. Women's participation in the wartime economy laid the groundwork for the feminist movements of the 1960s and beyond, challenging traditional gender roles and expanding opportunities in every sector of American life. Minority groups also found new opportunities during the war, though their experiences were often shaped by discrimination and inequality. African Americans, for example, migrated in large numbers from the rural South to industrial cities in the North and West, seeking jobs in defense plants. This migration not only transformed the demographic landscape of the United States, but also fueled the early momentum of the civil rights movement. The Double V campaign, Victory Against Fascism Abroad and Racism at Home, reflected a growing awareness among Black Americans that their contributions to the war effort gave them a moral claim to equality. Similarly, Hispanic and Asian American workers played vital roles in wartime production, helping to lay the foundation for future struggles for civil rights and inclusion. The cultural effects of wartime mobilization extended beyond the workforce. The experience of collective sacrifice, of rationing, victory gardens, war bond drives, and shared national purpose helped forge a stronger sense of unity among Americans. The war demonstrated that a diverse, democratic society could come together in pursuit of a common goal, transcending political, regional, and social divisions. This spirit of unity became a defining feature of American identity in the post-war era, fueling optimism and a belief in the nation's capacity to tackle any challenge. It also strengthened the bonds between citizens and the state, reinforcing the idea that government could and should play a role in ensuring the well-being of its people. At the same time, the war deepened America's commitment to education, science, and innovation. The demands of wartime research, from radar and jet engines to the atomic bomb, revealed the transformative power of scientific discovery. In the years that followed, the federal government invested heavily in education and research, establishing institutions like the National Science Foundation and funding programs to train new generations of scientists and engineers. Universities expanded, research labs multiplied, and a culture of innovation took root. This emphasis on science and technology became a cornerstone of America's global leadership, fueling advances in everything from medicine to computing to space exploration. The social changes unleashed by wartime mobilization also had profound political implications. The expansion of federal power during the war created new expectations for government's role in economic and social life. Programs like the GI Bill, which provided education and housing, benefits to returning veterans, helped create a prosperous middle class and transform the social fabric of the nation. Federal investment in infrastructure, housing, and education laid the groundwork for decades of economic growth and social mobility. At the same time, the experience of collective action during the war inspired new movements for social justice, from civil rights to environmentalism, as Americans applied the lessons of wartime mobilization to peacetime challenges. For German POWs, these cultural and societal changes were as surprising as the industrial feats themselves. Many had been taught that democracy was weak, fragmented, and incapable of decisive action. Yet here was a democracy that had not only mobilized its economy with breathtaking speed, but had also transformed its society in the process. It was a democracy that had become stronger, more unified, and more confident through the experience of war. And it was a society that continued to evolve, using the momentum of wartime mobilization to address long-standing injustices and expand opportunities for all. The cultural consequences of this transformation were not confined to the United States. American values, innovation, collaboration, resilience, and optimism became part of the nation's global identity, shaping its foreign policy and soft power. Through initiatives like the Marshall Plan, America exported not just goods and technologies, but also ideas about how societies could organize themselves to achieve prosperity and security. The image of the United States as a land of opportunity and possibility, a place where ordinary people could do extraordinary things, was deeply rooted in the experience of wartime mobilization. It was an image that inspired millions around the world and helped cement America's leadership in the post-war order. Even today, the cultural legacy of that era remains visible. The belief in the power of collective action, the expectation that government and industry will work together in times of crisis, and the confidence in America's capacity to innovate and adapt. All of these are products of the World War II experience. They are part of the national DNA, shaping how Americans respond to challenges and how the world perceives the United States. And they serve as a powerful reminder of the deeper meaning of that astonishing industrial miracle. It was not just about building weapons, it was about building a society and a future capable of meeting any challenge. The industrial mobilization that stunned German POWs during World War II was more than just an economic or military phenomenon. It was also an ideological triumph. It challenged deeply entrenched beliefs about the nature of power, the effectiveness of democracy, and the relationship between freedom and strength. Nazi propaganda had spent years portraying liberal democracies as decadent, disorganized, and incapable of sustained effort. In their worldview, only authoritarian regimes with their rigid hierarchies and centralized control could marshal the resources necessary for total war. Yet the United States, a nation built on individual liberty, free markets, and open debate, shattered that assumption. Its ability to transform itself into the most formidable war machine in history was a direct refutation of fascist ideology, and it carried profound moral and political implications. For the German prisoners who witnessed it, this was a revelation. Many had been raised to believe that democracy was inherently weak, that it lacked the discipline and unity needed to prevail in a struggle for survival. But the America they saw in wartime was anything but weak. It was organized, efficient, and fiercely determined. It had harnessed the creativity and energy of its people without resorting to coercion. It had forged a powerful partnership between government and industry without sacrificing individual freedom. And it had achieved levels of production and coordination that authoritarian regimes could only dream of. This forced many POWs to confront a difficult truth, that the Nazi system they had been taught to revere was, in many ways, less capable than the democratic system they had been taught to despise. This ideological reversal had profound consequences not just for individuals, but for the world order that emerged after the war. The United States' wartime success gave democracy a new credibility and appeal on the global stage. It showed that free societies could defend themselves, and not just defend themselves, but outperform and outproduce their authoritarian rivals. This lesson was not lost on the many nations that faced a choice between democratic and totalitarian paths in the years that followed. From Western Europe to East Asia, America's example inspired movements for political liberalization and economic modernization. The Marshall Plan, NATO, and the United Nations all reflected a new confidence in the democratic model, a belief that open societies could not only compete with authoritarian regimes, but could surpass them. The ideological impact was felt within the United States as well. The experience of wartime mobilization deepened Americans' faith in their own institutions and values. It demonstrated that democracy was not just a moral ideal, but a practical system, one capable of solving complex problems and achieving monumental goals. This newfound confidence shaped domestic politics in the post-war era, fueling ambitious initiatives like the Great Society, the space race, and the environmental movement. It also informed America's approach to the Cold War, where the ideological contest with the Soviet Union was as much about demonstrating the superiority of democratic capitalism as it was about containing communism. The moral dimension of America's industrial achievement was equally significant. The fact that the world's most powerful war machine had been built not for conquest but for liberation, to defeat fascism, liberate occupied nations, and defend democratic ideals, gave the United States a unique moral authority. This authority underpinned much of its leadership in the post-war world. American power was not just feared, it was respected and often welcomed. Nations devastated by war turned to the United States not only for material assistance but also for guidance in building democratic institutions and market economies. This moral leadership was a critical component of the post-war order, one that helped secure alliances, stabilize regions, and promote global prosperity. For the German POWs who witnessed the American industrial miracle up close, these moral and ideological dimensions were deeply unsettling. They were forced to confront the fact that their nation's defeat was not just a military failure, but a systemic one. The Nazi regime had promised strength, unity, and victory, but in the end, it had delivered ruin, division, and defeat. America, by contrast, had delivered on its promises. It had proven that freedom and strength were not opposites but complements, that democracy and discipline could coexist, and that a society built on individual rights could outproduce and outfight one built on fear and coercion. This realization was often painful, but it was also enlightening. It challenged deeply held beliefs and forced many former soldiers to rethink their assumptions about politics, society, and human nature. The ideological power of America's wartime achievement extended even to the Soviet Union, its future rival. Although Moscow remained committed to its own brand of authoritarian socialism, Soviet leaders could not ignore the evidence of America's success. They recognized that industrial capacity, technological innovation, and societal mobilization were critical to power in the modern world. This recognition drove many of the Soviet Union's policies in the decades that followed, from its emphasis on heavy industry and scientific research to its massive investment in space exploration and nuclear weapons. Yet despite these efforts, the Soviet system ultimately struggled to match the dynamism and adaptability of the American model, a fact that contributed significantly to its eventual collapse. The ideological lesson that emerged from World War II remains as relevant today as it was in 1945. In a world where authoritarianism is once again on the rise, America's wartime example offers a powerful reminder that democracy is not a weakness to be overcome, but a strength to be harnessed. It shows that free societies, when united by a common purpose, can achieve feats that authoritarian regimes cannot match. It demonstrates that creativity, diversity, and open debate, often seen as vulnerabilities, can be sources of extraordinary resilience and innovation. And it proves that power derived from the consent and participation of the people is ultimately more sustainable than power imposed through fear and repression. For the German prisoners who had once believed in the superiority of dictatorship, these were transformative insights. They left captivity with a new understanding of what makes a nation truly strong, not the number of tanks in its arsenal or the strictness of its discipline, but the vitality of its institutions, the dynamism of its economy, and the freedom of its people. It was a lesson written not just in the smoke of battlefields or the rubble of bombed cities, but in the roar of American factories, the hum of assembly lines, and the astonishing ability of an entire society to turn its wealth, creativity, and energy toward a single, shared purpose. The industrial miracle that so astonished German prisoners did more than shape ideologies and military strategies. It also transformed the global economy, culture, and political landscape. In many ways, the world we inhabit today is still living in the shadow of America's wartime mobilization. The systems, networks, and norms that emerged from that extraordinary effort have become deeply embedded in how nations interact, how economies grow, and how societies define progress. The result is a world profoundly influenced and in many ways built by the United States' ability to convert its civilian economy into a war machine and then back again into a peacetime engine of prosperity. One of the most significant legacies of that transformation was the creation of a new global economic order. The Bretton Woods Conference of 1944, held while the war was still raging, laid the foundations for institutions like the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank. These organizations, designed to stabilize currencies and finance reconstruction, were reflections of America's newfound economic power and leadership. The United States also championed free trade through initiatives like the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, believing that economic interdependence would reduce the likelihood of future conflicts. These efforts, supported by America's unparalleled industrial capacity, helped create a global trading system that would fuel decades of growth and bind nations together in ways that made another world war far less likely. The Marshall Plan, launched in 1948, was another manifestation of this economic leadership. Officially known as the European Recovery Program, it provided over $12 billion, more than $150 billion in today's dollars, to rebuild war-torn Europe. But the plan was about more than just reconstruction. It was an investment in stability, democracy, and long-term prosperity, and it relied on the United States' vast productive capacity to deliver. American factories supplied the machinery, materials, and expertise that helped revive European industries. American agricultural surpluses fed millions, and American corporations partnered with European businesses to modernize manufacturing, processes, and supply chains. The result was an unprecedented economic renaissance that transformed Western Europe into a dynamic, prosperous region and forged strong transatlantic alliances that continue to this day. This new economic order was accompanied by a powerful cultural shift. The United States, having proven its industrial and military might, became a global symbol of modernity and progress. American products, from automobiles and appliances to movies and music, flooded markets around the world. They were more than commodities. They were symbols of a lifestyle and a set of values. The abundance and diversity of American consumer goods reflected the dynamism of its economy, while the democratic ideals embodied in its culture offered a stark contrast to the rigid, state-controlled societies of the Soviet bloc. The American dream, with its promise of opportunity, innovation, and prosperity, became one of the most powerful narratives of the 20th century, and it owed much of its global appeal to the industrial strength that had been forged during the war. The influence of America's wartime experience extended even to the structure of global business. Many of the management techniques and organizational principles developed to coordinate massive wartime production became standard practices in the corporate world. Concepts like supply chain optimization, just-in-time manufacturing, and large-scale project management all trace their roots to wartime logistics and production planning. The emphasis on research and development, driven by the need for technological superiority during the war, evolved into a permanent feature of corporate strategy. Even the close collaboration between government and industry, once seen as a wartime necessity, became a hallmark of the American economic model, influencing how other nations approached industrial policy. The ripple effects reached beyond economics and business into the realm of diplomacy and geopolitics. America's ability to project power abroad was not just a function of its military might, but also of its capacity to provide economic assistance, build infrastructure, and support development. In Asia, programs like the Dodge Plan helped rebuild Japan's economy, laying the foundation for its transformation into a global economic powerhouse. In Latin America, initiatives like the Alliance for Progress sought to promote development and counter communist influence. In each case, America's industrial capacity and its willingness to deploy it in pursuit of broader strategic goals was a key component of its foreign policy. For the German POWs who had once marveled at the speed and scale of American production, the post-war world would have been almost unrecognizable. The same factories that had produced bombers and tanks were now producing cars and washing machines for export. The same logistics networks that had supplied armies across continents were now delivering goods to global markets. The same scientific breakthroughs that had yielded radar and nuclear weapons were now powering revolutions in medicine, electronics, and communication. What they had once seen as a terrifying expression of American power had become a force for global integration and prosperity. Yet, this transformation was not without its critics and complexities. America's economic dominance sometimes generated resentment, particularly among nations that feared becoming too dependent on U.S. markets or too vulnerable to American influence. The spread of American culture, often referred to as cultural imperialism, sparked debates about the erosion of local traditions and identities. And the close ties between government and industry, while a source of strength, also raised concerns about corporate power and inequality. These tensions reflected the dual nature of America's industrial legacy. It was both a source of immense opportunity and a driver of profound change, with consequences that were not always predictable or universally welcomed. Still, the overarching impact was undeniable. America's wartime mobilization had not only defeated fascism, it had set in motion a series of transformations that reshaped the global landscape. It had created new institutions, new norms, and new possibilities. It had demonstrated that industrial power could be a tool not just of destruction, but of creation, a means of building bridges, forging alliances, and improving lives. And it had established a model of economic and political leadership that would define the second half of the 20th century. The German prisoners who had once watched American factories with a mixture of awe and despair could hardly have imagined how far-reaching the consequences of that industrial miracle would be. They had seen only the immediate impact, the planes, the tanks, the endless supplies that flowed to the front. But in truth, those were just the beginning. The real legacy of America's wartime mobilization was not measured in bombs dropped or battles won. It was measured in the institutions built, the alliances forged, the innovations unleashed, and the world transformed. Today, nearly 8 decades after the end of World War II, the memory of America's industrial transformation continues to shape the way the nation understands itself and the way others understand it. It is not just a chapter in history books or a topic for documentaries. It is a living legacy woven into the country's political discourse, strategic planning, and collective identity. The astonishment that German POWs once felt when they saw factories turning from consumer goods to bombers overnight has become a defining part of America's national story, a reminder of what is possible when a free society commits itself fully to a common goal. This memory is preserved and celebrated in countless ways. Museums across the United States, from the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum to the Henry Ford Museum, tell the story of wartime production through artifacts, photographs, and personal accounts. Visitors can walk through reconstructed assembly lines, see the tools used by Rosie the Riveter and her peers, and stand beneath the bombers and tanks that once rolled off factory floors by the thousands. These exhibits are more than just historical displays. They are tributes to the ingenuity, determination, and collective effort that defined a generation. They remind Americans and visitors from around the world that the nation's strength has always rested on its ability to adapt, innovate, and mobilize. The legacy is also embedded in public policy and strategic thinking. U.S. defense planners regularly draw lessons from World War II when considering how to prepare for future conflicts. Concepts like surge capacity, the ability to rapidly scale up production in a crisis, are central to military planning. War games and strategic simulations often explore how quickly the defense industrial base could shift into high gear if a major conflict were to erupt. The government also invests heavily in maintaining a robust manufacturing infrastructure, supporting key industries and ensuring that critical supply chains are resilient. In many ways, these efforts are modern echoes of the War Production Board's work in the 1940s. The influence of this legacy is evident even in the language of American politics. Leaders from both parties frequently invoke the spirit of World War II mobilization when calling for action on contemporary challenges. Whether it's combating climate change, responding to a pandemic, or developing new technologies, politicians often speak of the need for a wartime footing or a national mobilization. These phrases resonate deeply because they tap into a shared historical memory, a belief that, when united by purpose, Americans are capable of extraordinary feats. The comparison is not merely rhetorical. It reflects a genuine understanding that the same principles that enabled the United States to outproduce Nazi Germany, coordination, innovation, public-private partnership, and collective sacrifice, remain relevant today. The private sector, too, carries forward this legacy. Many of the companies that played crucial roles in wartime production, Ford, Boeing, General Motors, and countless others, continue to be central to America's industrial and technological strength. Their corporate cultures, shaped by the demands of wartime conversion, still emphasize flexibility, scalability, and innovation. Even companies that did not exist during the war inherit this mindset. Silicon Valley firms, for example, often speak of moonshot projects, a term that traces its lineage back to the massive mobilization efforts of the 1940s and 1960s. The idea that seemingly impossible challenges can be overcome through focused effort and collective will is a direct descendant of the wartime experience. The legacy also lives on in the nation's educational and cultural institutions. Schools teach students not only about the battles and leaders of World War II, but also about the home front mobilization that made victory possible. Documentaries, films, and books continue to explore the topic, often through the eyes of those who lived it, including the German POWs who were so deeply affected by what they saw. Their testimonies, recorded in interviews and memoirs, provide a unique perspective on the war, offering insight into how America's industrial power appeared to those on the receiving end. These accounts often express a mixture of fear, respect, and admiration, and they serve as powerful reminders of the war's deeper lessons. One of those lessons is the importance of preparedness. The United States' ability to convert its civilian economy into a wartime powerhouse did not happen by accident. It was the result of careful planning, early investment, and a willingness to make bold decisions in the face of uncertainty. Today, that lesson is more relevant than ever. As new threats emerge, from cyber warfare and artificial intelligence to pandemics and climate-related disasters, the need for flexible, resilient systems is paramount. Policymakers and industry leaders alike study the example of World War II to understand how to build the capacity to respond quickly and effectively to future crises. Another enduring lesson is the value of unity. The mobilization of the 1940s was not just a triumph of industry, it was a triumph of national solidarity. Americans from all walks of life, men and women, young and old, rich and poor, contributed to the war effort in ways large and small. That sense of shared purpose was a powerful force multiplier, enabling the country to achieve far more than it could have through government action alone. In a time when political polarization often seems insurmountable, the memory of that unity serves as both an inspiration and a challenge. It reminds Americans that their greatest achievements have always come when they have worked together, setting aside differences for the sake of a larger goal. For the German POWs who witnessed the industrial miracle firsthand, these lessons were deeply personal. Many wrote about how the experience changed their understanding of America and of democracy itself. Some described feeling a grudging respect for a society they had once dismissed as decadent and weak. Others admitted that seeing the sheer scale of American production made them question everything they had been taught about the superiority of authoritarian systems. In their memoirs and letters, they often reflected on the irony of their situation. They had fought to defeat a nation they believed to be soft and disorganized, only to discover that its true strength lay precisely in its openness, diversity, and freedom. In this sense, the story of America's wartime industrial transformation is not just about the past, it is about the future. It is a reminder of what the country is capable of when it embraces its core values and works toward a shared purpose. It is a testament to the power of adaptability, innovation, and collaboration. And it is a warning that those qualities must be cultivated and preserved if the United States is to meet the challenges of the 21st century with the same confidence and success that defined its greatest triumph in the 20th. The story of America's wartime industrial miracle does not end with the closing chapters of World War II. In many ways, it is still being written in policy decisions, diplomatic strategies, economic priorities, and even cultural attitudes that continue to shape the 21st century. The lessons that so astonished German POWs remain deeply embedded in how the United States sees itself and its role in the world. They influence how America prepares for conflict, how it builds alliances, how it responds to crises, and how it projects power. They are, in short, a living blueprint for leadership in a complex and uncertain global landscape. One of the most significant ways this legacy manifests today is in the concept of strategic resilience. This term, widely used in defense and policy circles, refers to a nation's ability to absorb shocks, adapt to changing circumstances, and continue to function effectively in the face of disruption. It is, at its core, a modern expression of the same principles that defined America's wartime mobilization: flexibility, innovation, and collective action. Whether the challenge is a military confrontation, a global pandemic, a financial crisis, or a natural disaster, the United States' response is shaped by the belief that its strength lies not just in what it possesses, but in what it can become when circumstances demand it. This philosophy underpins many of America's most important strategic initiatives. Efforts to strengthen domestic supply chains, for example, are driven by the recognition that economic security is national security, a lesson learned in the 1940s when America's vast industrial base proved decisive to victory. Investments in emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and renewable energy reflect an understanding that technological leadership is essential to maintaining strategic advantage, just as radar, nuclear power, and jet propulsion were in the mid-20th century. Even space exploration, once a Cold War competition, is now viewed through the lens of resilience and capability, with NASA and private companies working together to build systems that could one day support human life beyond Earth. This legacy also shapes America's approach to alliances and partnerships. The United States understands that its ability to lead is magnified when it works with others, a lesson reinforced by the coordinated industrial efforts of World War II. Today, multinational initiatives such as the AUKUS Defense Pact, the Quad Alliance, and NATO's modernization programs all reflect this principle. These partnerships are not just about shared values or strategic interests. They are about pooling resources, aligning industrial capabilities, and creating systems that are greater than the sum of their parts. The same spirit of collaboration that once united American carmakers, aircraft manufacturers, and government agencies in a common cause now unites nations in the pursuit of collective security and technological superiority. The industrial legacy of World War II even shapes America's soft power, its ability to influence others through culture, values, and example. The narrative of a free society rising to meet an existential threat remains one of the most compelling stories in global politics. It inspires trust and admiration among allies and serves as a powerful counterpoint to authoritarian narratives that emphasize control and conformity. In an era when ideological competition is once again on the rise, this story, and the values it embodies, is a potent strategic asset. It reminds the world that democracy, far from being a liability, is a source of strength and creativity unmatched by any authoritarian system. For German POWs, this enduring strength would have been unimaginable when they first arrived on American soil. They had seen their own nation's factories shattered by bombs, its infrastructure strained to the breaking point, and its leadership blinded by ideology. They had believed that authoritarian control was the key to power, and they had watched that belief crumble before their eyes. The United States had shown them a different model, one that thrived on openness, adaptability, and the boundless potential of a free people. And that model has continued to prove its worth in every decade since. Yet this legacy also carries with it important responsibilities. The very qualities that made America's wartime mobilization so successful, unity, shared sacrifice, and collective purpose, cannot be taken for granted. They must be actively cultivated. In a time of political polarization and social division, the memory of the 1940s offers a powerful reminder of what can be achieved when Americans put aside their differences and work toward a common goal. It challenges citizens and leaders alike to think beyond short-term interests and partisan agendas, to focus instead on the long-term strength and resilience of the nation. This is perhaps the most important lesson of all, and one that extends far beyond the borders of the United States. The story of America's wartime industrial miracle is ultimately a story about human potential. It is a story about what societies can accomplish when they embrace change, harness creativity, and unite around shared values. It shows that even the greatest challenges, whether fascism in the 1940s, terrorism in the 2000s, or climate change in the 21st century, can be overcome when nations are willing to adapt and mobilize their full capacities. It demonstrates that power is not a static quality possessed by a select few, but a dynamic force that can be created, expanded, and directed toward any goal. For future generations, this story offers both inspiration and guidance. It reminds them that history's greatest achievements were not the result of inevitable destiny, but of deliberate choices. Choices to innovate, to cooperate, to believe in something larger than oneself. It challenges them to think not just about what their country is, but about what it can become when called upon. And it invites them to see the industrial miracle of World War II not as a relic of the past, but as a roadmap for the future, a testament to the enduring power of human ingenuity and collective will. In the end, the story of America's wartime industrial transformation is far more than a tale of factories and weapons. It is the story of how a nation harnessed its creativity, its resources, and its spirit to meet the greatest challenge in its history, and in doing so, reshaped the course of the modern world. It is a story about people, workers who labored day and night on assembly lines, engineers who devised new machines and methods, business leaders who repurposed entire industries, and government officials who coordinated an effort of unprecedented scale. It is a story about ideas, that freedom is stronger than tyranny, that democracy is more adaptable than dictatorship, and that the collective will of a free society can achieve feats that once seemed impossible. And above all, it is a story about transformation, the transformation of a nation, of a global order, and of the very meaning of power. For the German POWs who witnessed this transformation firsthand, the experience was nothing short of revelatory. Many had entered the war convinced of their nation's superiority, certain that authoritarian control and centralized planning would guarantee victory. Yet they watched, stunned, as the United States, a nation they had been told was weak and decadent, unleashed an industrial torrent that dwarfed anything the Axis powers could muster. They saw car factories turn into bomber plants in a matter of weeks, refrigerator manufacturers producing tank engines, and sewing machine companies churning out machine gun parts. They saw a society that had never known war on its own soil rise to meet the challenge with speed, ingenuity, and determination. And they realized, perhaps for the first time, that they were witnessing something far greater than a mere military mobilization. They were witnessing the power of a free people united by purpose. That realization carried profound psychological weight. It shattered illusions and forced a reckoning with deeply held beliefs. It demonstrated that strength is not synonymous with brutality, that discipline does not require oppression, and that unity need not come at the expense of freedom. For many of those prisoners, the sight of American industrial power changed not only their understanding of the war, but their understanding of the world. It planted seeds of doubt about authoritarianism and seeds of respect for democracy, seeds that would, in many cases, grow into a lifelong appreciation for the values they had once opposed. The lessons they learned remain just as vital today. The world of the 21st century is different in countless ways from the world of 1941, but the fundamental truths revealed by America's wartime mobilization still hold. Power still depends on the ability to adapt, to innovate, and to unite. Nations still rise and fall based on their capacity to convert resources into results, to transform potential into action, and societies still succeed or fail based on their willingness to work together in pursuit of shared goals. Whether the challenge is military aggression, economic competition, technological disruption, or environmental crisis, the principles that guided the United States to victory in World War II remain as relevant as ever. This continuity is both a comfort and a call to action. It reminds us that the tools we need to meet today's challenges already exist in our institutions, our industries, and our people. But it also reminds us that those tools must be maintained, strengthened, and used wisely. The ability to mobilize on a national scale is not something that can be taken for granted. It is a skill that must be practiced, a capacity that must be built. And just as importantly, the unity and shared purpose that make such mobilization possible must be nurtured in times of peace, not merely summoned in times of crisis. The legacy of America's wartime industrial miracle is written in steel and concrete, in assembly lines and shipyards, in the bombers that filled the skies and the ships that crossed the seas. But it is also written in the lives it changed, the societies it shaped, and the ideas it affirmed. It is written in the post-war prosperity that lifted millions out of poverty, in the democratic institutions that spread across the globe, and in the technological revolutions that continue to transform our world. It is written in the confidence that free societies, for all their flaws, divisions, and imperfections, can rise to meet even the greatest challenges when they act with determination and unity. And so, the astonishment of those German prisoners still echoes through history. It echoes in the halls of factories that can be retooled in days rather than years. It echoes in the laboratories where scientists develop technologies that redefine the limits of human capability. It echoes in the boardrooms and legislative chambers where leaders plan for the crises of tomorrow. And it echoes in the hearts of ordinary citizens who, when called upon, are capable of extraordinary things. This is the enduring message of America's wartime industrial transformation, that power is not a static possession but a living, dynamic force. It is the sum of a society's creativity, resilience, and will. It is the product of millions of individual choices to innovate, to cooperate, to sacrifice, and to believe. And it is a reminder that no challenge is insurmountable when a nation chooses to meet it together. So when we look back at that moment in history, when German POWs stood in disbelief at the sight of American factories roaring with unstoppable energy, we are not just looking at a story of the past. We are looking at a mirror of the present and a guide to the future. We are reminded that the same qualities that defined that era, adaptability, ingenuity, unity, and purpose, remain the keys to success today. And we are inspired by the knowledge that just as America once transformed its civilian economy into the greatest war machine the world had ever seen, it can transform itself again to meet whatever challenges lie ahead. Because the true miracle of that time was not in the machines that were built or the weapons that were forged. The true miracle was in the people, in their belief that they could achieve the impossible, and in their determination to prove that belief true. That is the legacy of America's industrial triumph. That is the lesson that astonished its enemies and inspired its allies. And that is the story that continues to define the United States, not just as a nation that once won a great war, but as a nation that still believes, even now, that there is nothing it cannot do when it chooses to act together.